Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Channel. Tonight, we are stepping into the strange and dazzling world of orchids. At first glance, they may seem like just another flower in a bouquet. But on deeper inspection, they begin to reveal nature's hidden genius. Orchids can deceive insects, collaborate with mushrooms, cling to treetops, and survive in extreme environments where no other flowers exist. Some are tiny enough to hide inside moss. Others unfurl blooms so unusual that they seem to be almost alien. This is a story of elegance, invention, and survival. It is a story shaped by rainforests, mountain mist, strange creatures, and millions of years of evolution. As we embark on this journey, the ordinary idea of flowers will begin to fade away, replaced by something far stranger, more intricate, and more captivating than most of us ever imagine. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your body soften. Allow your eyes to grow heavy. And as your mind begins to gently unwind, join me as we wander into this hidden world together. Let's begin. Some orchids can trick insects without offering any nectar. Many flowers pay visiting insects with a sugary reward, which makes the relationship feel fair and straightforward. Some orchids take a far stranger path. They lure a pollinator in with color, shape, scent, or a carefully staged illusion, then send it away hungry after the job is done. To an insect, that flower may seem like a promising source of food, a useful shelter, or the same kind of blossom that provided a reward somewhere else. The deception can be so effective that the visitor lands, probes, and leaves carrying pollen without realizing it was fooled. This is part of what makes orchids so captivating. They do not rely on beauty alone. They use performance. They use timing. They use misdirection. In a meadow or forest, an orchid may be running a quiet confidence trick in plain sight. That turns a simple bloom into something much more dramatic, almost like a living puzzle shaped by evolutionary pressure. Vanilla comes from the seed pods of an orchid. One of the most familiar flavors in the world begins with a climbing orchid that would look perfectly at home in a tropical forest. Vanilla does not come from a tree, a bean bush, or a spice shrub. It comes from a vine with pale flowers that open for only a short time. If pollination succeeds, the plant produces long green pods, which people often call beans, even though they are not true beans at all. Inside those pods are countless tiny seeds, surrounded by aromatic compounds that develop into the scent and flavor so many desserts depend on. That means ice cream, cakes, custards, and sweet drinks all carry a hidden orchid story. Once you know that, vanilla feels less ordinary. It becomes a reminder that one of the world's most beloved tastes comes from a flower family famous for mystery and extravagance. Even in a simple kitchen cupboard, the orchid world has already found its way in. Orchid seeds are so tiny they can drift like dust. If you split open an orchid pod, what spills out does not look like a pile of sturdy seeds ready for planting. It can look more like pale powder, almost too insubstantial to belong to a flowering plant at all. Individual seeds are so small and light that air currents can carry them far from the parent plant. A single pod may release an immense cloud of possibility, scattering future orchids across bark, leaf litter, moss, or open ground. Yet there is a catch hidden inside that abundance. These seeds carry almost no stored food, which means they begin life in an unusually precarious state. They are built for travel, not comfort. Instead of packing a lunch for the journey, they rely on landing in just the right place, under just the right conditions. That combination of extreme smallness and extreme risk makes their story astonishing. An orchid can cast its hopes into the wind by the million, and only a few may find a way forward. Some orchids look uncannily like bees, flies, or wasps. At first glance, a few of these flowers can seem less like plants and more like tiny creatures paused in the middle of some secret performance. Petals may resemble wings. A patterned lip may suggest the body of an insect. Soft textures and precise colors can make the illusion feel unexpectedly convincing, especially to the animals the flower is trying to influence. To human eyes, it is already startling. To an insect guided by instinct, scent, and shape, it can be persuasive enough to trigger a response. This is where orchids begin to feel almost theatrical. They do not merely bloom, they imitate. They borrow the look of living things and turn petals into visual bait. That imitation is not random decoration. It can shape who visits, how they move, and whether pollination happens at all. In some species, the resemblance is so strange and specific that it is hard not to feel a little amazed that natural selection can sculpt a flower into something so eerily familiar. Orchids grow on every continent except Antarctica. That global spread is one reason orchids are so remarkable. They are not just tropical curiosities confined to steamy jungles and collector greenhouses. They appear across an astonishing sweep of the planet, from equatorial forests to temperate meadows and mountain regions where winters bite hard. You can find them in the Americas, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia, each place shaping its own forms and strategies. Some cling to trunks in humid air. Others rise from cool ground among grasses or woodland leaves. This broad reach shows that orchids are not delicate in any simple way. They can be highly specialized, yet as a family, they are also deeply adaptable. Antarctica stands apart because the conditions are too severe for them, but almost everywhere else they have found opportunities. That changes the scale of the story. Orchids are not a narrow botanical niche. They are a worldwide phenomenon, woven into ecosystems across the globe, often hidden in places people pass without ever noticing. Many orchids cannot even sprout without the help of fungi. For many plants, a seed contains enough stored food to push out those first hopeful structures on its own. Many orchids begin with far less independence. Their seeds are so minimal that they often need a fungal partner to help them start life at all. In the soil, or in damp organic matter on bark, the right fungus can enter the seed and supply nutrients that the tiny embryo cannot access by itself. Without that early assistance, germination may never happen. It is a startling arrangement because it means the beginning of an orchid's life is not simply a private triumph of seed and sunlight. It is a partnership, intimate and mostly invisible. Beneath the beauty people admire, there is dependence and exchange. A bloom that later looks self-possessed and extravagant may have owed its first fragile steps to another organism hidden from view. That hidden alliance makes the orchid world feel deeper and stranger, as though part of its true story is always happening underground. One orchid can produce millions of seeds from a single pod. That number sounds almost excessive, until you remember how uncertain an orchid's early life can be. By producing a vast quantity of tiny seeds, a plant dramatically increases the odds that at least a few will land where survival is possible. It is a strategy built on scale rather than certainty. Instead of investing heavily in a small number of robust offspring, the plant releases an enormous multitude and lets chance, wind, moisture, microbes, and habitat decide the rest. There is something awe-inspiring about that gamble. One successful flower can become a storm of potential, each speck carrying the outline of a future plant. Most will not make it. That is part of the design. Yet the sheer number turns failure into possibility. It is a reminder that nature often solves difficult problems with staggering abundance. In the case of orchids, a single pod can become a quiet explosion of futures, too small to notice individually, but immense when imagined together. Some orchids bloom for just one day, then vanish. There is something almost unreal about a flower that spends months or years preparing for a display so brief that a person could miss it between breakfast and bedtime. Yet some orchids do exactly that. A bud opens, reveals a bloom at full intensity, and then the show is over with astonishing speed. This fleeting schedule can make the event feel precious, but it also serves practical purposes. A short bloom can align with a narrow window of pollinator activity, favorable weather, or the plant's own limited resources. The result is a kind of botanical urgency. A flower does not always need to last. It needs to succeed at the right moment. That transforms the experience of seeing one. You are not just looking at a pretty blossom. You are witnessing a timed event at the end of a long preparation. In that sense, a brief orchid bloom can feel less like decoration and more like an appearance, sudden and exact, and gone again. Orchid flowers evolved into some of nature's most elaborate traps. Not every orchid invites a visitor in and lets it leave in a simple, straightforward way. Some flowers guide insects with narrow passages, slippery surfaces, or carefully placed barriers that control where the animal can go. The visitor enters expecting food, shelter, or some other benefit, then finds itself funneled along a route that serves the plant's needs first. In some species, the path inward is easy, while the path out is highly restricted. That matters because pollen has to be attached to a very particular part of the body, or picked up from a very particular location, for the whole mechanism to work. These flowers are not traps in the dramatic sense of a snapping jaw. They are architectural traps, shaped by evolutionary fine-tuning. Their power lies in precision. A blossom becomes a corridor, a gate, or a one-way system. Once you realize that, an orchid flower stops looking passive. It starts to seem engineered, almost unsettlingly deliberate. The world's smallest orchids can fit on your fingertip. Some of the tiniest members of this family are so small that a person could overlook them, even while staring directly at them. Their flowers may be only a few millimeters across, which means an entire bloom can sit comfortably on the tip of a finger and still leave space to spare. In a rainforest, these miniature orchids do not dominate the scene. They hide in moss, on damp bark, or among films of moisture where the whole world seems scaled down. Up close, though, their smallness is not simplicity. Many still possess intricate lips, delicate petals, and highly specific forms, all compressed into a structure smaller than a coin. That is part of the wonder. Evolution did not reserve complexity for large and obvious things. It worked with the tiniest dimensions too. A flower can shrink toward invisibility, yet still carry elegance, precision, and a complete strategy for survival, all within the smallest imaginable frame. The largest orchid plants can weigh as much as a person. At the other extreme, some orchids become so large and heavy that they overturn every delicate stereotype attached to the group. Instead of a modest houseplant sitting politely on a windowsill, imagine a vast mass of stems, roots, and leaves building over the years into something dense enough to rival the weight of an adult human. These giants may spread across tree trunks or cultivated supports in thick clumps that seem closer to living architecture than to anything fragile. Their roots tangle and thicken. Their stems multiply. Their flowering displays can become immense, not because one bloom is enormous, but because the whole plant has accumulated such power over time. This scale is startling because it sits inside the same family as the fingertip species. The range feels almost unbelievable. Within orchids, you can move from miniatures so small they vanish in moss to sprawling botanical heavyweights that command space, effort, and admiration simply by enduring and growing. Some orchids spend years growing before a single bloom appears. Patience is written deep into the lives of many of these plants. An orchid may put all of its energy into roots, leaves, and storage structures for season after season, while giving no visible hint of the floral display a grower or wild observer is waiting for. To a person in a hurry, that can feel almost unreasonable. Yet from the plant's point of view, it is careful strategy. Blooming is expensive. It demands energy, water, timing, and favorable conditions. A premature display could waste precious resources if the season turns against it or pollinators fail to appear. So some orchids bide their time. They build strength quietly. They wait for the right moment. When a long-delayed flower finally opens, it carries the weight of all that hidden preparation. That delay changes how you see the bloom. It is not merely pretty. It is the visible end of an extended investment, a reward that may have taken years of restraint to reach daylight at last. Certain orchids live high in rainforest trees, not in soil. Many people imagine a flower as something rooted firmly in the ground, drawing life from earth beneath it. In tropical forests, that expectation falls apart. Countless orchids live perched on branches and trunks high above the forest floor, where light is stronger and air moves freely through the canopy. These plants are not parasites draining the tree. They use it as a place to live, almost like tenants taking up residence in an elevated neighborhood built of bark, rain, and drifting debris. Water arrives in bursts from storms, mist, and humid air. Nutrients may come from decaying leaves, dust, and organic scraps caught in crevices. It is a precarious address, exposed and vertical, yet orchids have made it work on a grand scale. Looking up into a rainforest canopy, you are not just seeing branches and leaves. You are seeing suspended gardens where flowers have left the ground behind and claimed a world in midair. Others grow directly from rocks in places that seem almost barren. Some orchids choose landscapes that look, at first glance, almost hostile to plant life. They anchor themselves into cracks in stone, where there is little obvious soil and where sun, wind, and rapid drying can make survival look improbable. These are not lush, forgiving environments. Water may arrive only briefly before running away. Nutrients are scarce. Temperatures can swing sharply across the day. Yet orchids find footholds in seams, pockets, and rough surfaces where a little moisture lingers just long enough. Over time, roots explore the rock face with astonishing persistence, turning a hard and unforgiving wall into a place where life can hold on. There is something deeply compelling about that image. A flower, associated with refinement and beauty, is also capable of living where the world seems stripped down to stone and weather. It reminds you that elegance in nature is not always softness. Sometimes it is endurance shaped into bloom. Some orchids survive in cool mountain mist near the snow line. Not all orchids belong to hot and steamy places. Some live in high mountain regions where clouds drag across the slopes, temperatures stay low, and snow may lie surprisingly close by. In those settings, the air can feel thin, cold, and wet all at once. Light may be intense when the sky clears, then vanish behind mist a moment later. For a plant, it is a demanding world of exposure and fluctuation. Yet certain orchids are built for it. They grow in sheltered crevices, among grasses, or in damp alpine habitats where moisture remains available even when warmth is limited. Their presence there expands the imagination. It means the orchid story reaches not only into tropical heat, but also into lofty places where breath shortens and weather turns suddenly. A bloom appearing near the snowline carries a different kind of marvel. It feels like proof that this family can follow beauty upward into conditions most people would never associate with orchids at all. A few orchids thrive in swamps, bogs, and wet meadows. There are orchids that prefer places where the ground gives underfoot, where water gathers, and where the air above the earth feels heavy with moisture. In swamps and bogs, roots must cope with saturated conditions that many plants would find suffocating. In wet meadows, seasonal flooding can reshape the whole rhythm of life. Yet some orchids flourish there, rising from grass or moss with flowers that seem almost improbable against such soft and waterlogged ground. These habitats can look peaceful from a distance, but they are full of hidden pressures. Water chemistry matters. Drainage matters. The balance of surrounding species matters. An orchid in a bog is not simply tolerating wetness. It is part of a finely tuned ecological arrangement. That makes the sight of one all the more compelling. In a place where boots sink and mist hangs low, a flower appears that is neither accidental nor fragile. It is perfectly suited to a landscape many people would underestimate. Some orchids live underground for most of their lives. There are species that spend the greater part of their existence out of sight, hidden beneath the surface where no passerby would suspect them. For long stretches, nothing announces their presence. No leaves wave in the breeze. No stem marks the spot. Their life is conducted in darkness, tied to underground resources and hidden biological relationships, until the time comes to send up a flowering structure or fruiting body above ground. This habit makes them feel almost secretive, as though they belong to another category entirely. We think of flowers as conspicuous things, made to be seen. These orchids reverse that expectation. Most of the story happens below. What appears at the surface is only a brief message from a much longer unseen existence. That hidden lifestyle also makes them easy to miss and difficult to study. A whole population may be waiting beneath the soil while the landscape appears empty, carrying on an invisible botanical life just beyond ordinary human notice. Orchids are one of the largest plant families on Earth. There are so many kinds of orchids that they make many other flower families look modest by comparison. Scientists have described roughly 28,000 species, and new ones still appear in forests, grasslands, and mountains, where people thought the botanical story was already known. That means this single family contains more species than all birds, and more than all mammals, by a tremendous margin. Once you notice that scale, orchids stop seeming like rare decorative houseplants and start looking like one of the great success stories of life on land. They are not confined to one climate, one shape, or one style of survival. They have spread into steamy canopies, windy cliffs, dim woodland floors, and cloud-soaked slopes. When you say the word orchid, you are not naming one familiar kind of flower. You are opening the door to an immense world that has been diversifying for ages. There are orchids that never produce any leaves at all. Leaves seem so central to the idea of a plant that a leafless flowering species can feel almost impossible at first. Yet some orchids have taken that path. Instead of relying on broad green blades to gather light, they reduce or abandon leaves and place more importance on other structures or hidden partnerships that support their lives. In some cases, roots handle much of the visible work. In others, the plant lives in deep association with fungi and remains pale or strangely subdued because it is not making food in the usual leafy way. The result is an orchid that looks uncanny, almost unfinished, as if it has stepped outside the normal rules of botany. That oddness is exactly what makes it so memorable. A person can spend years imagining flowers as variations on a familiar design, then discover that orchids include forms which quietly discard one of the most recognizable plant features of all. Suddenly, the family seems even less ordinary. Some orchids live as quiet climbers on tree branches. While many orchids perch in place, some take on a more wandering life and move outward along supports as they grow. They creep or climb through the branching structure of trees, using the elevated framework to reach light and space in crowded habitats. This gives them a very different presence from compact species that stay in one tight cluster. A climbing orchid can trace a path through the canopy, extending itself over time like a living line drawn across bark and wood. That growth habit changes the rhythm of the plant. It is not just settling into a perch. It is exploring. It is advancing. Each new section can root, leaf out, and prepare future blooms farther along the branch. In a forest, that means the plant becomes part of the architecture around it, almost weaving itself into the tree's shape. Once you picture that, the orchid world feels more dynamic. Some members are not static ornaments at all. They are slow botanical travelers. Orchid roots can photosynthesize when exposed to the light. Most people think of roots as hidden organs that stay underground, pale and invisible, while leaves do the visible work of gathering light. Many orchids overturn that expectation completely. Their roots may spill over pots, creep across bark, or hang in the open air where sunlight can reach them directly. When that happens, the roots themselves can help make food for the plant. Green tissue beneath the outer surface contains chlorophyll, which means these roots are not merely anchors or drinking straws. They are part of the energy system. This gives the whole plant a different character. It is as if the line between root and leaf has become more fluid. In bright tropical habitats, that flexibility is a real advantage. A plant living on a branch cannot rely on soil below, so every exposed surface matters. Once you notice green roots taking part in the work of survival, orchids seem even more inventive than they did before. Many orchid roots are wrapped in a silvery, sponge-like skin. If you look closely at the roots of many orchids, especially the ones that live above ground, you may notice a pale coating that gives them a silver or ghostly appearance. This is not dead tissue or damage. It is a specialized outer layer built for a life of sudden rain, rapid drying, and exposed air. When dry, it can look almost papery and light-colored. When wet, it often turns translucent and reveals the living green or pale tissue beneath. That quick transformation is one of the small marvels of orchid design. The coating acts like a protective interface between the plant and an unpredictable environment. It helps manage water, shields delicate inner tissues, and supports a way of life that would be far harsher without it. A root covered in that strange pale sheath does not look like a conventional root at all. It looks adapted, weather-wise, and almost engineered for the treetops. That strange outer root layer can drink water in seconds. In the canopy, rain does not always linger. A tropical downpour may soak a branch for a brief spell, then vanish into heat and moving air. Orchids that live there cannot behave like plants with access to steady ground moisture. They need to capture water fast before the opportunity disappears. The specialized outer tissue on many roots allows exactly that. It can take up moisture with remarkable speed, swelling and changing color as it becomes saturated. What looked dry and silvery a moment ago may suddenly appear darker and more alive, as though the root has awakened. That speed matters because the plant may only have minutes to benefit from a passing shower, dripping fog, or overnight condensation. It is an elegant solution to a difficult problem. These orchids are not waiting beside a dependable reservoir. They are living in a world of brief chances, and their roots are designed to seize each one almost the instant it arrives. Some orchid roots grip bark so tightly they seem glued on. A tree branch in the wild is not a calm and reliable surface. It sways in wind, dries in heat, and sheds water quickly after rain. For an orchid living there, attachment is not a minor detail. It is the difference between staying in the light and falling to the forest floor. Many species solve that challenge with roots that press into bark crevices and cling with impressive force. Over time, they can form so closely to the surface that the plant can look fused to the tree itself. This is not a casual resting place. It is a firm hold established through persistence and structure. The roots find texture, exploit tiny gaps, and create a durable connection that lets the plant ride storms and shifting weather. There is something compelling about that grip. It gives the orchid a quiet toughness. Beneath the elegance of the flowers lies a tenacious strategy, one that lets beauty hold fast in a moving world. Orchid leaves can store water for long dry spells. Some orchids live where water arrives in bursts and then disappears, which means survival depends on planning ahead. Their leaves are not always thin, soft structures that lose moisture quickly. In many species, they become thick, leathery, or fleshy, turning into storage organs as well as light gatherers. That extra body gives the plant a reserve it can draw upon when days turn hot and rain fails to return. A leaf in such a plant is not only a surface for sunlight. It is a quiet insurance policy. You can often see this adaptation with the eye alone. The foliage looks substantial, almost deliberate in its solidity, as though the plant expects hardship and has prepared for it. This changes the way drought is experienced. The orchid does not immediately collapse at the first sign of dryness. It enters the lean period with savings already in place. Even the leaves become part of a strategy built around patience and endurance. Many orchids also store water in swollen stems called pseudobulbs. Some orchids carry their reserves in structures that look like little green flasks lined up along the plant. These swollen stems act as storage organs, holding water and nutrients that can support the orchid when conditions become less generous. Depending on the species, they may be round, flattened, canna-like, or oddly sculpted, which gives different orchids very different silhouettes even before a flower appears. Their presence tells a story about the habitats these plants come from. In places where moisture can be abundant one week and scarce the next, storing supplies inside the body is a brilliant solution. The plant can gather when times are good, then live more calmly when the weather shifts against it. This also gives the orchid a sense of continuity across seasons. A flowering display may fade, but the swollen stem remains as a record of past abundance and a source of future resilience. It is survival made visible in the plant's architecture. Some orchids survive drought by slowing their growth dramatically. When conditions become dry, not every plant responds by pushing harder. Some orchids do the opposite. They reduce their pace, ease back on active growth, and enter a more cautious mode that conserves precious resources. New roots may pause. Fresh leaves may wait. Even the overall look of the plant can become stiller, as though it has shifted into a lower gear. This is not weakness. It is strategy. Growth demands water, energy, and risk. By delaying expansion until conditions improve, the plant protects what it already has. In a habitat where dry periods are expected, that restraint can make all the difference. It is easy to admire rapid growth, but there is another kind of intelligence in knowing when not to grow. Orchids reveal that beautifully. They do not always race toward the future. Sometimes they survive by becoming deliberate, patient, and almost motionless, enduring the harsh interval until the world becomes generous again. A few orchids can drop into dormancy and wait for rain. Some species take patience even further and pass through part of the year in a state that feels almost suspended. Leaves may yellow and fall. Visible growth may disappear or shrink back so thoroughly that the plant seems to have retreated from the world. To an untrained eye, it can look finished. In truth, it is waiting. Hidden tissues remain alive, holding the memory of the plant until rain, humidity, or a seasonal shift signals that it is time to begin again. This rhythm is astonishing because it means an orchid can temporarily step out of view without truly leaving the landscape. Life is still there, only folded inward. When moisture finally returns, new growth emerges with a sense of renewal that can feel almost theatrical. The contrast is powerful. A plant that looked lost comes back with energy stored in silence. In this way, dormancy is not absence. It is a strategic pause written into the orchid's calendar. Some orchid roots form hanging curtains beneath tropical branches. In humid forests, certain orchids produce so many long aerial roots that they begin to dangle in loose sheets beneath the branches that support them. Seen from below, the effect can be extraordinary. What first looks like a tangle may resolve into a pale curtain, swaying softly with air movement and catching droplets from mist or rain. These roots do more than create spectacle. They expand the plant's reach into the atmosphere around it, increasing the area available for moisture capture and anchoring future growth. They also give the orchid a strong visual identity. Instead of appearing as a compact clump, it becomes something draped and architectural, almost like a living chandelier suspended in the canopy. That change in form matters. It reminds you that orchids are not just flowers attached to stems. They can shape space around themselves in dramatic ways. Even before a bloom appears, the plant may already have transformed its corner of the forest. Orchid roots can reveal whether a plant is thirsty. One of the most remarkable things about many orchids is that their condition can sometimes be read directly from the roots themselves. When well hydrated, exposed roots may appear fuller, firmer, and greener beneath the surface layer. As they dry, they often become paler, duller, or more wrinkled in appearance. That means the plant carries visible signals of its water status in plain sight, almost like a built-in language for anyone who learns how to notice it. This is especially useful because orchids do not always respond well to guesswork. Their needs are shaped by airflow, light, temperature, and the way their roots are meant to function. Watching the roots brings you closer to the plant's actual condition rather than a rigid schedule. There is something intimate about that. You are not just watering a flower. You are learning to read a living organism through subtle changes in color, fullness, and texture, as though it is quietly telling you what it needs. Orchid flowers are built with astonishing left and right symmetry. If you imagine drawing a line straight down the middle of many orchid flowers, the two sides often mirror each other with remarkable precision. That balance is not just pleasing to the eye. It is part of how the flower presents itself to the creatures it hopes to attract. In many plants, blooms can be approached from several directions without much consequence. In orchids, shape often matters in a much stricter way. Petals, sepals, and the central structures are arranged so the visitor encounters a carefully organized front, almost like the facade of a tiny biological machine. This gives the flower a sense of intention. It does not look casually assembled. It looks designed to guide attention and movement. Even people who know nothing about botany often sense this immediately. An orchid can seem elegant, poised, and strangely deliberate because the flower is built around balance. And that balance helps turn a blossom into a focused invitation. Most orchids twist their flowers upside down before they open. During development, many orchid buds perform a subtle act that completely changes the final presentation of the bloom. As the flower matures, the stalk or ovary often rotates so that what began at the top ends up at the bottom when the blossom opens. The result is a flower that appears upside down compared with its original orientation. This sounds like a small detail, but it transforms the entire architecture of the bloom. Structures that would otherwise sit awkwardly are repositioned into a far more useful arrangement for visiting animals. It is one of those hidden movements in plant life that feels almost unbelievable once you learn it happens. A bud is not simply swelling until it opens. It is turning itself into the correct pose before the show begins. That secret rotation gives the mature flower its familiar form. Beneath the stillness of the final bloom lies motion, adjustment, and a quiet preparation that most observers never notice. This floral twist helps pollinators land in exactly the right place. Once that rotation has taken place, the flower is no longer just visually appealing. It has become easier to use. The lower part of the bloom is now positioned where an incoming insect can brace itself, crawl forward, or settle with a degree of stability that would otherwise be lost. In other words, the twist helps create the correct landing geometry. For a pollinator, that can make the difference between a clumsy encounter and a successful visit. For the orchid, it can make the difference between wasted effort and accurately placed pollen. This is what makes orchid design so absorbing. A movement that happens before the flower even opens ends up shaping the behavior of another species later on. Cause and effect are stretched across time. A slight turn in development leads to a precise moment of contact in the field. What looks decorative from the outside is often deeply practical, tuned to make the next stage of the story work. Almost every orchid flower has a special petal called a lip. Among the petals of an orchid, one often stands apart so clearly that it seems to belong to a different design altogether. This distinctive structure is known as the lip, and it is one of the defining features of the family. It may be broad, narrow, frilled, striped, spotted, elongated, or sculpted into a shape that looks startlingly unlike an ordinary petal. In many species, it is the part of the flower that first captures a viewer's attention because it carries the boldest pattern, the most dramatic color, or the most unusual contour. That visual prominence is no accident. The lip often serves as the focal point of the bloom, the place where attraction, guidance, and interaction come together. When people say orchids look strange, theatrical, or unusually intricate, this special petal is often the reason. It gives the flower a center of personality. Without it, many orchids would lose the very feature that makes them feel so distinctive. That lip often acts like a landing platform for insects. What looks to us like an extravagant flourish is often the working surface for another creature. In many orchids, the broad or specially shaped lower petal provides a place where an insect can arrive, grip, and orient itself before moving deeper into the flower. This turns the bloom into more than a passive object. It becomes a stage built with traffic flow in mind. The visitor does not simply blunder in from any angle. It is guided toward a particular zone where contact with the reproductive structures becomes far more likely. Some lips are firm and level. Others are curved, textured, or marked with lines that seem almost like visual cues. All of this shapes behavior. A bee, fly, or moth meets not only color and scent, but also a physical surface that tells it where to go next. In orchids, even the welcome mat can be part of a larger strategy, elegant in appearance and exact in purpose. Many orchids pack pollen into waxy bundles instead of loose dust. In countless flowers, pollen is released as a fine powder that can scatter freely onto visiting bodies or drift away on the air. Many orchids take a very different approach. Instead of loose grains being brushed here and there, the pollen is gathered into compact masses that hold together like tiny packages. This changes the whole logic of pollination. Rather than dusting a visitor broadly and hoping for the best, the flower prepares a more concentrated transfer. It is a bold strategy because it relies on accurate contact. The insect has to brush the right place in the right way for the bundle to be removed and carried onward. Yet when it works, the system is wonderfully efficient. A significant portion of the flower's pollen moves as one unit, ready to be delivered with precision to another bloom. This is classic orchid thinking. Instead of relying on abundance and randomness, many species lean toward control, packaging, and exact biological placement. Those pollen bundles can stick directly onto an insect's body. Once removed from the flower, these compact packets do not simply ride along by chance. They can attach themselves to a pollinator with surprising firmness, often by means of a sticky pad that grips a precise part of the body. Depending on the species, the bundle may end up on the head, back, abdomen, or even near the mouth parts. This is where the orchid's engineering becomes almost uncanny. The flower is not just handing pollen to any passing creature. It is placing a package onto a chosen location, almost like a tag that must later meet a matching target in the next flower. If the insect approaches another bloom in the proper way, the carried bundle lines up with the receptive surface and the transfer can be completed. Watching this happen, or even imagining it closely, makes pollination feel less like dust in the wind and more like a carefully choreographed exchange between flower and animal. Some orchids use hinged parts that snap pollinators into position. Not every orchid relies on stillness. In a few species, parts of the flower can move in response to touch, creating a sudden change that helps place the visitor exactly where the plant wants it. An insect steps onto a sensitive surface or presses against a trigger point, and a hinged structure shifts rapidly enough to alter the whole encounter. The visitor may be tipped, jolted, or guided forward in a way it did not expect. That movement can bring the insect into direct contact with pollen or the receptive parts of the bloom with startling efficiency. It is an extraordinary idea for a flower. We often think of blossoms as static objects, waiting patiently for whatever happens next. Orchids challenge that assumption. Some participate actively in the moment, using touch-sensitive mechanics to shape behavior in real time. The result is a pollination event that feels less like chance and more like a device being activated by a key. Others force insects through one narrow exit to dust them. In some orchid flowers, entering is not the difficult part. The real challenge begins once the insect is inside and tries to leave. The interior may be shaped so that easy escape is blocked, while one particular route remains open. That route is narrow, controlled, and positioned so the departing visitor must squeeze past the flower's reproductive structures. As it pushes through, pollen can be attached or deposited with impressive accuracy. This turns the bloom into a one-way passage rather than a simple open chamber. The insect's own effort to get free becomes part of the orchid's design. There is something both elegant and sly about that arrangement. The flower does not overpower its visitor. It redirects it. A moment of confusion becomes a moment of pollination. In this way, the orchid uses space itself as a tool. Walls, openings, and constraints do as much work as color or scent, shaping the outcome through architecture alone. Orchid flowers can be so precise they suit one pollinator perfectly. Some orchids are not trying to appeal to a broad crowd of visitors. They are tuned so closely to a particular pollinator that the match can feel almost exclusive. The flower's depth, opening, scent, timing, and internal structure may align with one animal's body and behavior far better than with anything else nearby. A tongue of a certain length, a head of a certain width, or a specific nightly routine can make all the difference. This degree of fit is one of the most fascinating things about orchids, because it reveals how far evolution can push specialization. A bloom stops being a general signal and becomes something like a private arrangement between species. That intimacy carries risk, because dependence on one partner can leave a plant vulnerable if that partner declines. Yet it also produces some of the most extraordinary designs in the natural world. Precision becomes beauty, and beauty becomes an ecological relationship shaped almost to perfection. Some orchids imitate female insects in shape, scent, and texture. Among the strangest strategies in the orchid world is the decision not merely to attract an insect, but to impersonate one. In some species, the flower takes on the appearance of a female insect with unsettling precision. Its shape may suggest a body. Its surface may feel velvety or plush in ways that echo an insect's exterior. Most astonishing of all, it can release chemical signals that resemble the scent produced by a receptive female. To a passing male, this is not just a flower in the grass. It can register as a living possibility. That level of imitation feels almost impossible until you remember how powerful natural selection can be over long stretches of time. Every successful deception increases the chance that the floral design will persist. What emerges is a bloom that blurs the line between plant and animal lure. It is one of nature's boldest performances, built from petals, chemistry, and astonishing evolutionary patience. Male bees may try to mate with orchid flowers by mistake. That extraordinary imitation can lead to a scene that feels almost surreal. A male bee, convinced by the flower's appearance and scent, may land and attempt to mate with it. This behavior is sometimes called pseudo-copulation, though the word hardly captures how strange the moment really is. The insect is not casually investigating. It is responding with full instinctive commitment to a signal that has been expertly forged. In struggling, pressing, and repositioning itself against the bloom, it may pick up or deposit pollen without ever receiving the encounter it expected. The orchid has effectively hijacked a reproductive impulse and turned it into transport. There is something both elegant and startling about that. Instead of offering food, the flower exploits one of the most powerful drives in animal life. It does not need to overpower the bee. It only needs to persuade it for a few crucial seconds. Those seconds are enough to keep the plant's lineage moving forward. Some orchids smell like rotting meat to attract flies. Beauty in orchids is not always sweet, delicate, or conventionally lovely. Some species go in the opposite direction and produce odors that people often find revolting. The smell can resemble decaying flesh, damp carrion, or other forms of biological breakdown. To us, that seems like an awful advertisement. To certain flies, it is a powerful invitation. These insects are drawn to places where they expect to feed, lay eggs, or find useful organic matter, and the orchid taps into that attraction with remarkable precision. A person approaching such a flower may recoil. A fly may arrive exactly as intended. This reminds you that pollination is not about pleasing human senses. It is about reaching the right audience by whatever means works. In that light, the unpleasant scent becomes deeply impressive. The orchid is not failing at fragrance. It is speaking a different language, one perfectly tuned to the instincts of the creatures it needs. Others smell sweet only at the exact hour pollinators arrive. Some orchids do not waste their perfume on the empty air. Instead, they release fragrance in a schedule so well timed that the scent intensifies when the right pollinators are most likely to be active. This means a flower can remain relatively modest for much of the day, then suddenly become aromatic during a narrow window that matters most. That timing is astonishing, because it shows how closely the plant's biology can be linked to the daily routines of another species. A flower is not just colorful or scented in a general way. It is running on a clock. When the pollinator's hour arrives, the message is sent. Before or after, the bloom may stay far quieter. This selective release likely helps conserve resources while also sharpening the signal when it counts. The result is a kind of botanical punctuality. The orchid does not simply hope to be noticed. It speaks at the moment its chosen listener is passing by. A few orchids release fragrance only after sunset. As daylight fades and many flowers fall quiet, some orchids begin a different phase of their performance. Their fragrance emerges in the evening or deepens after dark, when the air cools and night-active pollinators begin to move. In daylight, such a bloom may seem almost restrained. By night, it becomes communicative. This shift changes the emotional feel of the flower entirely. It is no longer part of the bright daytime chorus of color and scent. It belongs to the evening world, where smell can travel through darkness long before a pollinator sees the bloom itself. That timing is a reminder that many important biological encounters happen while people are sleeping. Forests, gardens, and tropical edges can host quiet nocturnal dramas led by flowers that wait until sunset to make themselves known. An orchid that perfumes the night feels mysterious for good reason. Its true audience arrives under dim skies, and it has evolved to greet that audience on time. Night-blooming orchids often rely on moths with very long tongues. Many moth-pollinated orchids are built for visitors that do not hover over blossoms casually, but approach with specialized mouthparts capable of reaching deep into narrow floral tubes. A long-tongued moth can access nectar that shorter-tongued insects cannot reach, which immediately narrows the field of possible partners. This creates a fascinating match between anatomy and architecture. The flower can hide its reward at the far end of a long passage, ensuring that only a certain kind of visitor can get to it. As the moth feeds, its head or body brushes the structures needed for pollen transfer. In darkness, scent guides the approach, but shape determines success. There is something magical about this invisible fit between a moth moving through the night and a flower waiting in stillness. One has evolved a feeding instrument of extraordinary reach. The other has evolved a floral depth that makes use of it. Together, they form a partnership that feels almost secret. Some orchids offer real nectar, but many are expert deceivers. Across the orchid family, there is no single rule about honesty. Some species genuinely reward visitors with nectar and take part in a straightforward exchange. A pollinator arrives, feeds, and in the process carries pollen onward. Other species have discovered that they can get the same transport without paying the same price. They advertise food, imply food, or resemble flowers that usually provide food, yet offer nothing when the visitor arrives. This contrast is part of what makes orchids so endlessly compelling. Within one family, you find both cooperation and trickery. Some blooms operate like open shops. Others behave more like elaborate stage sets. A pollinator cannot always know which kind of encounter it is entering until it has already committed. For the orchid, that uncertainty can be useful. Deception saves resources that would otherwise go into producing nectar. It is a risky approach, but when it succeeds, the plant gains an advantage by manipulating expectation rather than fulfilling it. Certain orchids trick pollinators with the promise of shelter. Food is not the only thing an insect may seek from a flower. Some are also looking for a place to hide from weather, escape danger, or settle for a period of rest. Certain orchids exploit that need by shaping their blooms like inviting chambers or protected spaces. To a small animal, the flower may appear to offer a convenient refuge. It can seem like a safe nook in a world full of wind, rain, predators, and exposure. Once the insect enters, however, the orchid's real purpose takes over. The visitor may be guided through a path that leads to pollen transfer rather than comfort. This kind of deception is especially fascinating because it broadens the whole idea of what a flower can promise. The lure is not sweetness on the tongue, but safety for the body. In the orchid world, even the ancient desire to find shelter can be redirected and folded into the reproductive plan of a plant. Others mimic rewarding flowers while secretly offering nothing at all. Some orchids succeed not by imitating insects, but by imitating other flowers. They borrow visual signals that pollinators have already learned to associate with a good reward. Color, shape, and general presentation may resemble nectar-producing neighbors closely enough that a passing insect assumes the same payoff awaits here as well. That makes the orchid a botanical impersonator, slipping into a trusted pattern and benefiting from the reputation of someone else's honesty. It is a brilliant move because animals do not always inspect every bloom from scratch. They often rely on quick judgments shaped by previous experience. The orchid takes advantage of that mental shortcut. The pollinator lands with expectation, explores, and may leave empty-handed but still carrying pollen. This gives the flower a parasitic relationship with perception itself. It profits from the insect's learned optimism. In that moment, the orchid is not just part of the floral crowd. It is a counterfeit tucked among the genuine articles. One pollination visit can succeed or fail with astonishing precision. In many orchids, everything depends on a narrow sequence of movements going exactly right. A visitor may arrive at the correct flower on the correct day, drawn by the correct scent, yet still leave without completing the plant's purpose if its body angle is wrong or its path through the bloom is slightly off. That level of precision makes each encounter feel almost suspenseful. Success is possible, but it is never guaranteed. The flower may be built so specifically that only one posture or one root allows the pollen to meet the right structure. A slight misstep can mean the difference between reproduction and nothing at all. This is what gives orchids such dramatic tension. Their beauty often hides a system with little room for error. The stakes are high because the mechanism is refined. When it works, the result seems elegant and effortless. When it fails, the whole opportunity may vanish until the next visitor arrives, if one arrives at all. Darwin predicted an orchid pollinator before anyone had seen it. In the 19th century, Charles Darwin examined a Madagascar orchid whose structure seemed to point toward an animal that nobody had yet documented. Rather than treating the flower as a curiosity, he read it like evidence. The bloom possessed a nectar spur of such unusual depth that any successful pollinator would need an extraordinarily long feeding organ to reach the reward. From the flower alone, he inferred the existence of a matching creature. That is what makes this episode so memorable. It was not a lucky guess in the ordinary sense. It was a prediction drawn from anatomy, function, and the logic of natural selection. A flower became a clue to an unseen animal. That idea still feels thrilling because it shows how much biological history can be hidden inside form. The orchid was not merely beautiful. It was a message from evolution, and Darwin understood that the message pointed outward to another species waiting to be found. He studied a flower with a nectar tube of extraordinary length. The orchid at the heart of this story was Angraecum sesquipedale, a star-shaped species from Madagascar with a nectar-bearing spur that astonished anyone who saw it. That long tube was not a decorative flourish. It created a very specific challenge. Nectar sat deep within the structure, far beyond the reach of ordinary insects. To feed successfully, a pollinator would need a tongue long enough to reach the hidden reward, while also brushing the flower in the right way. Darwin recognized that the length of the spur was not meaningless excess. It was part of the functional relationship. The flower had been shaped in response to some equally remarkable partner. This is one of the most captivating things about orchids. A single structure can hold a whole mystery inside it. Looking at that unusual blossom, Darwin was not simply admiring rarity. He was confronting a biological question written in living form. Years later, a matching moth was finally discovered. The remarkable insect that seemed to exist only as a prediction did, in time, come into view. A hawk moth with an exceptionally long proboscis was later identified as the pollinator capable of reaching the nectar deep inside Darwin's orchid. The match was so striking that it gave the earlier inference lasting scientific drama. Here was the animal the flower appeared to demand. Its feeding organ was long enough to access what most visitors could not, and in doing so, it could carry out the pollination the orchid required. The story endures because it feels like a natural history detective case that resolved across decades. A flower posed the riddle. Careful reasoning proposed the answer. Later, evidence confirmed that the answer was real. Even now, that sequence has an almost cinematic quality. It reminds us that in biology, extreme structures are often not accidents. They can be signs of hidden partners and relationships that wait patiently to be discovered. That famous prediction became one of evolution's most elegant stories. What gives this episode such lasting power is not only that the prediction was correct, but that it captured a core evolutionary idea in one vivid example. A flower and an animal appeared, linked by reciprocal demands. The orchid's deep nectar spur suggested a moth with unusual reach, and the existence of such a moth made sense of the flower's extraordinary form. In one relationship, people could glimpse adaptation, specialization, and the shaping power of natural selection. That is why the story is told again and again. It is simple enough to grasp quickly, yet deep enough to reward long reflection. A blossom from Madagascar became a living argument that species are not fixed decorations in the world. They are historical outcomes, altered by interaction over immense spans of time. Few scientific stories manage to be this precise and this memorable at once. It feels elegant because the explanation fits the form so beautifully. Orchids helped reveal how tightly species can evolve together. Across the orchid family, pollination often depends on highly specific signals, timings, and structures, which makes these flowers powerful examples of close evolutionary partnership. Researchers have long used orchids to explore how floral traits and pollinator behavior influence one another, because the links can be unusually clear. Scent, shape, depth, timing, and reward strategy may all be tuned to particular animals. In some cases, the fit is so narrow that even small changes can alter which visitor succeeds. This has made orchids central to discussions of co-evolution, where one species helps shape the evolutionary path of another. The idea is not that both organisms always change in perfect lockstep, but that each can become a significant selective force in the other's world. Orchids dramatize that possibility beautifully. A flower does not just sit in an ecosystem waiting to be noticed. It can become an active participant in a long biological conversation with the creatures around it. Some orchid relationships are so specific they verge on exclusivity. Many flowering plants can rely on a broad assortment of visitors, but orchids often move toward a much narrower arrangement. Studies of orchid pollination have shown that some species are served by only one effective pollinator, or by a very small set of them, especially in systems shaped by deception or highly specialized floral design. That degree of selectivity gives these relationships an almost private quality. The flower is not speaking to the whole insect world. It is addressing a chosen recipient, using cues that only certain bodies and behaviors will answer correctly. This can make pollination impressively efficient when the partner is present. It can also make the orchid vulnerable when that partner is scarce or absent. The balance between precision and dependence is part of what makes orchids so fascinating. They show how evolution can favor extraordinary fit, even when that fit comes with risk. In some cases, the relationship becomes so narrow that it feels nearly exclusive. A pollinator's body can shape an orchid across deep time. If a flower is visited repeatedly by animals with similar sizes, movements, and feeding tools, those recurring encounters can become an evolutionary force. Over many generations, traits that improve contact with the right body part or reward the right behavior may be favored, while less effective forms fade away. In orchids, where pollination can depend on remarkable precision, this shaping influence can be especially strong. The length of a nectar spur, the position of pollen, the curve of a petal, or the timing of scent release may all reflect long histories of interaction with particular pollinators. This means the body of an insect or moth can leave a trace in floral design, not by intention, but through repeated selection across ages. That idea is one of the most awe-inspiring in all of botany. A flower can become a record of encounters stretched over deep time, sculpted not only by climate and chance, but by the anatomy of another living creature. Orchid evolution has produced one of nature's richest flower experiments. Few plant families display such a sweeping range of floral strategies as orchids. Across the group, evolution has generated elaborate traps, deceptive lures, specialized scents, unusual shapes, tightly targeted rewards, and intricate structures for directing pollen transfer. This diversity is why orchids can feel less like a single floral theme and more like a vast gallery of evolutionary experiments. Each lineage seems to ask a slightly different question about how to attract, manipulate, or cooperate with pollinators. The answers can be subtle or spectacular, but together they create a family of astonishing variety. Scientists who study orchid pollination repeatedly point to this richness, because it provides a rare window into how different strategies arise and persist. For a listener, that means orchids are never just one kind of marvel. There are many marvels at once. The family contains an entire archive of botanical invention, shaped by opportunity, conflict, and long biological trial and error. Tiny changes in scent can split one orchid into many species. In some orchids, scent is not a minor detail added on top of the flower's appearance. It is the key signal that determines which pollinator responds. Research on orchid pollination has shown that relatively small shifts in floral odor chemistry can redirect attraction from one insect species to another. Once that happens, gene flow between plant populations may be reduced because different pollinators begin carrying pollen along different routes. Over time, this can help drive the formation of new species. It is an astonishing thought. A change too subtle for most people to detect may reshape the future of an entire lineage. The flower does not need a dramatic new color or a radically different form. A modified chemical message may be enough. Orchids make speciation feel immediate and strangely intimate. A few altered molecules in the air can change who arrives, who mates, and eventually what kind of orchid exists in the landscape. Orchid diversity exploded as pollinators diversified around the world. One reason orchids became so extraordinarily diverse may be that they evolved alongside an equally dynamic world of animal pollinators. As bees, flies, moths, butterflies, and other groups diversified across different regions and habitats, they created new opportunities for flowers able to exploit distinct behaviors and bodies. Orchids appear to have taken exceptional advantage of that expanding menu of possibilities. Different pollinator communities in different places could favor different scents, shapes, flowering times, and tactics, helping lineages branch and multiply. Scientists studying orchid evolution often emphasize this interplay between floral traits and pollinator diversity because it helps explain how one plant family could radiate so dramatically. The result is the astonishing richness we see today. Orchids did not diversify in isolation. They diversified in conversation with a changing animal world. That makes their abundance feel even more impressive. Each species is not just a flower, but a chapter in a much larger evolutionary expansion. Orchid seeds contain almost no food for a growing embryo. Most seeds begin life with a packed lunch. They carry stored food that helps the embryo push out its first root and shoot before it can gather energy on its own. Orchid seeds are startlingly different. They are so stripped down that they contain almost none of that reserve. Inside is a tiny embryo with almost no nutritional cushion, which makes the beginning of life far more precarious than it is for most flowering plants. This is one reason orchid reproduction feels so extreme. The plant produces vast numbers of seeds, but each one begins with almost nothing in hand. It is a gamble built on lightness, chance, and outside help. A listener might imagine a seed as a safe little capsule prepared for the future. In orchids, that comforting image breaks apart. The seed is more like a fragile possibility, launched into the world with astonishing economy, and with very little stored support for what comes next. Because of that, many rely on fungi from the very start. Since so many orchid seeds begin life with almost no internal food, they often need help immediately after landing. That help comes from fungi in the surrounding environment, which can enter the developing seed and provide the nutrients needed to begin growth. It is an astonishing dependency because it means the orchid is not truly starting life alone. From the very first stage, another organism may be involved in making survival possible. This changes the whole emotional shape of the story. A seed drifting through the air can seem independent and adventurous, but its future may depend on meeting the right hidden partner in the dark. Without that meeting, the journey ends before it truly begins. Orchids reveal that independence is not always the rule in nature. Sometimes a plant's first act is not self-sufficiency, but relationship. The beginning of the orchid life cycle is therefore not just botanical. It is ecological from the very first moment. Fungi can feed orchid seedlings before they make any leaves. Before an orchid seedling has unfolded leaves or begun gathering light in the usual way, it may already be receiving nourishment from fungal partners. At that stage, the young plant is still too undeveloped to function like a normal green seedling. It has not yet become the familiar orchid people recognize. Instead, it exists in an early hidden form, dependent on another organism to bridge the gap between seed and self-sustaining plant. That bridge is one of the most remarkable chapters in the whole orchid story. A seedling is being fed before it can truly feed itself. In effect, the fungus helps carry it through a vulnerable threshold in life. This makes orchid development feel almost like a rescue operation carried out underground or inside damp organic debris. Long before a bloom, and even before a leaf, there is a period of quiet support. It is a reminder that some of nature's most important exchanges happen well before anything visible appears. Some orchids depend on fungal partners for their entire lives. For certain orchids, the fungal relationship does not end after early development. It continues throughout life, which means the plant never becomes fully independent in the way many other green plants do. Even as it matures, it still draws crucial support through fungal connections in the soil or surrounding organic matter. This lifelong dependence is extraordinary because it reshapes our idea of what a flowering plant is supposed to be. We tend to imagine a flower as a self-powered organism rooted in one place and making its own way through sunlight and water. Some orchids complicate that picture deeply. Their lives remain bound to hidden networks beneath the surface, where fungi help sustain them long after the seedling stage has passed. That makes the visible flower feel almost deceptive. What we admire above ground is only the bright and brief expression of a life still supported by unseen partners below, in a relationship that can last from beginning to end. A few orchids live by stealing energy through fungal connections. Among the strangest orchids of all are those that use fungi not simply as helpers, but as pathways for taking in energy that originated elsewhere. The fungus may be linked to nearby green plants or to decaying material in the environment, and the orchid taps into that connection rather than relying mainly on its own photosynthesis. In that sense, the plant becomes a quiet thief in the underground economy. It is not hunting or chasing in any familiar way, yet it is still drawing benefit through a network built by another organism. That idea can feel almost startling when attached to a flower. We do not usually imagine blooms as participants in hidden acts of biological appropriation. Orchids make us reconsider that. Beneath a woodland floor or within damp habitat, energy can move along unexpected routes. In a few species, the flower above is only the visible sign of a much stranger strategy unfolding out of sight, in darkness and silence. These orchids can survive without making much food themselves. Some orchids have reduced their reliance on photosynthesis so far that they make very little of their own food. They may be pale, brownish, yellowish, or otherwise subdued in color because they lack the rich green associated with active leaf-based energy production. Instead of investing heavily in making sugars from light, they live by drawing resources through fungal relationships. This gives them an eerie presence. They can look more like waxy woodland apparitions than familiar plants, as though they have stepped outside the standard rules of botany. Their existence is deeply fascinating because it shows how flexible life can become when a lineage finds another route to survival. A person might assume that a flowering plant must live mainly by sunlight. These orchids prove otherwise. They survive by leaning into a different system, one that is hidden, indirect, and dependent on biological partnerships. In doing so, they make the forest floor feel stranger and more interconnected than it first appears. Some woodland orchids bloom in deep shade because fungi help sustain them. Deep woodland shade can be a difficult place for flowering plants. Light is limited, the canopy filters much of the sun, and the forest floor can seem dim even at midday. Yet some orchids manage to bloom in these shadowed places, and part of that success may come from support gained through their fungal relationships. Instead of relying only on the thin and scattered light that reaches the understory, they gain access to another stream of resources below ground. This helps explain how a delicate blossom can appear in a place where photosynthesis alone might seem insufficient. The effect is almost magical when seen in the wild. A flower emerges from dim leaf litter where the light feels too sparse for such elegance. Once you understand the hidden partnership beneath it, the scene becomes even more compelling. The bloom is not defying the forest. It is participating in a deeper exchange that allows beauty to appear where little sunlight falls. Orchid survival often depends on invisible underground partnerships. When people admire orchids, they usually notice flowers, leaves, roots, and perhaps the dramatic habitats where the plants grow. What they do not see is often just as important. Beneath the soil or hidden in decaying bark and organic matter, fungal partners may be making the difference between life and death. These associations can support germination, early development, and in some cases, continuing nutrition. That means survival is not always written in the visible plant alone. It is written in relationships below ground, in a living network most observers would never suspect. This is one of the most awe-inspiring truths about orchids. Their beauty is connected to an invisible world of exchange, dependence, and biological negotiation. A bloom that seems solitary may in fact be the surface expression of a partnership stretching down into darkness. Once you know that, an orchid no longer looks like an isolated marvel. It looks like a visible node in a hidden living system. Without the right fungi, an orchid seed may never awaken. An orchid seed can arrive in a promising place, settle into moisture, and still fail to begin life if the necessary fungal partner is absent. That is how exact the requirement can be. The seed is not waiting only for water, warmth, and time. It may also be waiting for a specific biological encounter, one that unlocks the next stage of development. This makes orchid reproduction feel almost hauntingly uncertain. Even in the right habitat, success is not guaranteed. The future depends on something the eye cannot see and the wind cannot carry. A person might imagine that once a seed lands safely, its story is underway. In orchids, the deeper truth is that the story may still be on pause. The seed can remain a tiny, unopened possibility until the correct fungus appears. That hidden requirement adds tension to every dispersal event. Millions may travel, but only the few that meet the right partner can truly begin. An orchid's hidden life can begin long before any leaf appears. Long before a recognizable plant rises into view, an orchid may already be alive and developing in secret. After a successful encounter with the right fungus, the seed can enter an early stage in which it grows as a small, hidden structure before leaves or obvious roots appear. This means the orchid's life is underway well before it resembles the plant most people imagine. There is something deeply captivating about that unseen beginning. A forest floor, a patch of moss, or a quiet bit of bark may already be hosting orchid life with no outward sign at all. The future flower exists only as a hidden beginning, nourished in darkness and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That stretches the orchid story backward into a secret chapter. What later seems like a sudden appearance is really the continuation of a much older process. The visible plant is not the start. It is simply the first moment we are invited to notice. The lady's slipper orchid traps insects inside its pouch. At first glance, the flower looks almost whimsical, as though one petal has been inflated into a little slipper. For a small insect, though, that pouch is not just decoration. It can become a chamber that is easy to enter and surprisingly difficult to leave. The shape invites curiosity. A visitor slips inside while searching for food or following visual cues, then discovers that the smooth inner walls and unusual architecture have changed the rules of the encounter. Instead of backing out the way it came, the insect may find itself funneled deeper into the flower's design. That is where the slipper orchid becomes unforgettable. It turns a bloom into a guided route. What appears charming to us becomes a functional device for controlling movement. The whole flower is an exercise in persuasion through form. A little pouch in the grass becomes a trap, and a trap becomes a way of making sure the next stage of the orchid story can happen. Those trapped visitors must crawl out past the pollen. Once inside the pouch, the insect is not simply imprisoned at random. The flower's design usually leaves a narrow way out, and that exit is positioned with extraordinary cunning. To escape, the visitor must climb upward through a route that takes it past the orchid's reproductive structures. In that tight passage, pollen can be placed onto the insect, or pollen already carried from another flower can be deposited in exactly the right spot. This gives the whole event a remarkable sense of choreography. The insect thinks it is solving a problem. The orchid has already arranged the solution. Every step toward freedom becomes part of the plant's strategy. That is what makes slipper orchids so compelling. The trap is not there to punish or consume. It is there to guide. The flower uses inconvenience as a form of precision, turning a brief moment of confusion into a carefully managed opportunity for reproduction before the visitor finally finds the light again. Some slipper orchids use light windows to guide insects upward. Inside certain slipper orchids, escape is not left entirely to luck. The flower can contain translucent areas or brighter openings that act like little windows, drawing the trapped insect toward the direction the orchid wants it to go. For a small visitor inside a dim floral chamber, light becomes a powerful cue. It signals a possible route outward, and the insect follows it instinctively. This is where the bloom begins to feel almost architectural. It is not only shaped as a chamber and a corridor. It also uses illumination as part of the guidance system. The insect climbs toward brightness, and in doing so passes through the narrow path required for pollen transfer. A person looking at the flower from outside may see beauty and odd shape. Inside, the insect experiences something more like a guided maze. That combination of form and light makes slipper orchids feel astonishingly sophisticated, as though the flower has learned how to direct traffic with a lantern. The monkey orchid's flower can resemble a tiny monkey face. Some orchids astonish not because of what they do to insects, but because of what they seem to show to us. The monkey orchid is one of the most memorable examples. Its flower can present a pattern so suggestive that people immediately see the face of a small monkey gazing out from the bloom. Dark eyes seem to appear. A nose seems to sit in the center. The whole effect can feel so clear that it is hard to believe it is the work of petals and floral parts rather than deliberate illustration. This resemblance is not evidence that the flower evolved for human amusement, yet it powerfully changes how people respond to it. Suddenly the bloom feels almost animate, as though a little personality has emerged from the plant world. That is part of the enchantment of orchids. They can cross the boundary between botany and imagination with a single glance, making a flower feel startlingly like a face peering back. The bee orchid can look startlingly like a female bee. Few orchids demonstrate visual mimicry more memorably than the bee orchid. Its lip can be shaped, colored, and textured in ways that strongly suggest the body of a female bee. Brown, velvety surfaces, subtle markings, and a convincing outline combine to produce an effect that is startling even to human observers. To a male bee, guided by instinct and perception tuned for reproductive opportunity, the illusion can be powerful enough to trigger approach and contact. That makes this flower feel almost mischievous. It is not merely decorated in an insect theme. It is presenting itself as something biologically meaningful to the very creature it needs. The result is one of the most famous examples of floral deception in the natural world. A patch of grass can contain what looks like tiny bees perched among the stems, yet those forms are flowers carrying out a strategy shaped over time. In the bee orchid, imitation becomes both spectacle and survival. The dove orchid carries a shape that looks like a white bird. Inside the flower of the dove orchid, there is a structure so suggestive that people across generations have seen the image of a small white dove nestled within the bloom. The effect can be surprisingly vivid. Wings seem folded. A little body appears poised in the center. The resemblance gives the flower an almost ceremonial presence, as though the orchid is carrying a sculpture hidden inside its petals. This is one reason the species has become so beloved. It seems to contain a second image within the first, rewarding close observation with something that feels like discovery. Unlike strategies tied directly to pollination mechanics, this wonder belongs mainly to the human eye and imagination. Yet it matters because it shows how orchids engage not only ecosystems, but culture and emotion as well. A flower becomes memorable when it appears to hold a bird within it. Suddenly, botany feels touched by symbolism surprise, and almost impossible elegance. Some Dracula orchids resemble little faces peering from the petals. Dracula orchids are already striking because of their elongated sepals and often dark, dramatic coloring, but the most unsettling detail may be the sense that a face is looking out from the center. In some species, the arrangement of inner parts creates the impression of eyes, a nose, and a tiny expression framed by the surrounding floral structures. The result can feel playful, eerie, or oddly intimate depending on the flower and the observer. This face-like illusion makes the bloom difficult to forget. It is as though the orchid has gathered shadow, pattern, and shape into something that seems almost aware. The name Dracula adds to that atmosphere, though the real marvel lies in the floral form itself. Orchids often seem theatrical, and these flowers carry that quality beautifully. They do not just bloom, they appear. A cool, damp cloud forest blossom suddenly seems to contain a hidden watcher, peering out from within the petals with uncanny calm. One orchid is famous for smelling strongly of chocolate. Not all remarkable orchid scents are deceptive or unpleasant. Some species are treasured because they produce fragrances that people find unexpectedly delicious. And one of the most famous examples is the chocolate-scented orchid. When in bloom, it can release an aroma that strongly recalls chocolate or warm cocoa, especially during certain parts of the day. That scent can feel almost magical because it joins two worlds people do not usually connect. You approach a flower and receive the impression of a confection. The surprise is part of the appeal. Smell is such a direct sense that the effect can be immediate and memorable, turning a visual encounter into something richer and more emotional. This kind of orchid reminds us that flowers are not experienced only through color and shape. They can fill the air with associations, memories, and cravings. In that moment, the plant world feels startlingly generous, as though a bloom has borrowed a scent from a kitchen and set it loose in the garden. Another smells like coconut when the air turns warm. Some orchid fragrances are not constant from dawn to dusk. They become stronger, sweeter, or more recognizable when the temperature rises, which can make a warm afternoon feel like the key to the flower's secret. In certain orchids, that secret is a scent strikingly reminiscent of coconut. When the air is cool, the fragrance may be faint or easily missed. As warmth builds, the aroma emerges more clearly, and the plant seems to change character. This temperature-linked release gives the experience a wonderful sense of timing. The flower does not merely possess a scent. It reveals it under the right conditions. For anyone nearby, the effect can feel like a hidden layer of the orchid has suddenly opened. A bloom that looked beautiful in the morning may smell like a tropical dessert by midday. That transformation makes the encounter more dynamic and more memorable, as though the weather itself has helped unlock part of the orchid's personality. Some orchids have petals that trail like ribbons in the wind. Not every orchid flower is compact and neatly contained. Some stretch outward into astonishingly long, narrow petals or sepals that hang, twist, or stream away from the center like ribbons. When air moves through the habitat, those trailing parts can sway and flutter, giving the flower a sense of motion, even while the plant remains rooted in place. The effect is mesmerizing. A bloom becomes less like a static ornament and more like a living banner, shaped by every passing breeze. This unusual form may also influence how the flower is noticed by pollinators, adding movement and silhouette to the signals already offered by color and scent. For human observers, though, the immediate impression is often wonder. The orchid seems to have stepped beyond familiar floral proportions and entered a more extravagant world of design. A flower with streaming petals does not simply sit in the landscape. It performs within it, using motion as part of its presence. vanilla orchids must often be pollinated by hand in cultivation. In many vanilla-growing regions, people cannot simply wait for nature to handle the work. Instead, growers move from flower to flower and pollinate them by hand with careful, practiced motions. Each boom must be opened gently and manipulated with precision so that the pollen reaches the receptive surface inside. It is delicate work, and it turns a familiar flavor into something far more intimate and labor-intensive than most people ever imagine. Behind a bottle of vanilla extract lies a chain of human attention that begins with a single flower and a brief opportunity. This makes vanilla farming feel almost astonishingly personal. The crop is not gathered from an effortless abundance. It is coaxed into existence bloom by bloom. A person stands where a missing pollinator once would have acted, replacing an ecological relationship with patience and skill. The sweetness people know begins in a moment of touch between human hands and an orchid flower. Natural vanilla pollinators are missing in many farming regions. Vanilla is native to parts of the Americas, where certain local pollinators can carry out the task that the flower requires. But when people began cultivating vanilla elsewhere, especially on islands and in tropical regions far from its original home, that natural partnership often did not come along for the journey. The vine could grow, climb, and bloom beautifully, yet the flowers would remain unpollinated because the right insect or animal was absent. This is one of those quietly astonishing truths hidden inside everyday life. A crop can travel around the world, but its most important relationships may not travel with it. That absence changes everything. It turns a wild or semi-wild process into a human responsibility, and it shows how deeply agriculture can depend on ecological context. A vanilla plantation may look productive and orderly, yet without the right pollinators, it is missing an invisible piece of the original orchid story, and people must step in to complete it. Each vanilla flower opens for only a brief window. Vanilla flowers do not stay available for long. A bloom opens, reaches its moment of readiness, and then the opportunity begins to slip away almost at once. For growers, that creates a rhythm of attention that can feel urgent and exacting. The flowering vine is not offering a long and leisurely season for each individual blossom. It is presenting short chances that must be noticed in time. This is part of what makes vanilla so fascinating. The familiar flavor is tied to fleeting events, each one small on its own, and yet essential to the final harvest. A flower may appear lovely and calm in the morning, but behind that calm lies a countdown. If pollination does not happen soon enough, the chance may be gone. That brevity gives the whole process a dramatic edge. It reminds us that orchids often tie success to narrow windows, where timing matters just as much as beauty or abundance. Miss that window, and the flower may never set a pod. Because the bloom is receptive for such a short period, delay can mean complete failure for that flower. If pollination does not happen in time, the blossom usually withers and drops away without producing the long seed pod that people prize as vanilla. That makes each open flower feel precious in a very practical sense. It is not just one attractive stage in the life of the vine. It is a single chance at future harvest. For growers walking among blooming plants, this creates a sense of urgency hidden inside an otherwise peaceful scene. Every successful pod begins as a brief decision point. Either the flower is pollinated at the right moment, or that possibility disappears. There is something almost dramatic about how much depends on so little time. A pod that will later be cured, shipped, and transformed into flavor begins with a narrow and fragile opportunity that can vanish in a single day. Vanilla curing takes months after the orchid pod is picked. Harvesting the pod is not the end of the story. In some ways, it is only the beginning of the transformation people care about most. Freshly picked vanilla pods do not yet possess the rich and familiar aroma associated with finished vanilla. They must pass through a long curing process that can stretch across months, during which the pods are treated, dried, sweated, and carefully conditioned. This gradual work changes them profoundly. Color deepens, texture shifts. Complex aromas begin to emerge and concentrate. The process feels almost alchemical, as though the orchid's raw fruit is being coaxed into a more expressive form. That long wait adds another layer of wonder to vanilla. It is not a flavor that appears instantly at harvest. It must be developed through time, care, and controlled handling. What finally reaches a kitchen or bakery carries with it not only the life of an orchid, but also months of patient post-harvest transformation. The flavor of vanilla develops after harvest, not before. One of the most surprising things about vanilla is that the prized flavor is not fully present in the green pod at the moment it is picked. The pod must be harvested and then processed so that enzymes and chemical changes can unlock the aromas people recognize. In other words, the taste associated with vanilla is developed rather than simply collected. That fact changes how the whole crop feels. It is not like plucking a ripe fruit and enjoying what is already there. It is more like beginning a slow unveiling. The orchid provides the raw material, but time and careful handling reveal the fragrance hidden inside. This makes vanilla feel even more extraordinary. A familiar sweetness turns out to depend on a delayed transformation, one that takes place after the plant's visible work is finished. The pod leaves the vine as potential. Only later does it become the deep, warm, unmistakable flavor that people know and love around the world. Orchid collecting once sparked an international craze called orchid fever. There was a time when orchids were not merely admired. They were pursued with a kind of fervor that swept across wealthy circles, nurseries, glasshouses, and private estates. Rare species became objects of obsession. Collectors longed for unusual shapes, strange colors, and exotic origins. Greenhouses filled with costly specimens. Catalogs and plant sales fed competitive desire. The whole phenomenon became known as orchid fever, and the name suits it well because the passion often went far beyond calm botanical appreciation. Orchids seemed to promise beauty, status, rarity, and a touch of the wild all at once. To own an extraordinary orchid was not only to possess a flower. It was to take part in a global fascination fueled by empire, exploration, wealth, and taste. This period reveals something important about orchids. They do not only shape ecosystems, they can also seize the human imagination so completely that people reorganize money, effort, and ambition around the pursuit of a bloom. Victorian plant hunters risked disease, shipwreck, and ruin for orchids. During the height of orchid collecting, plant hunters were sent into forests, mountains, and remote regions in search of species that wealthy buyers in Europe had never seen. These expeditions were not romantic strolls through gardens. They could involve dangerous travel, unfamiliar climates, rough sea voyages, political instability, and severe illness. Men pursuing orchids sometimes faced fever, injury, financial disaster, and the constant possibility that a shipment would be lost before it ever reached its destination. That is part of what makes this chapter so gripping. Orchids were powerful enough to draw people into genuine hardship. The flowers became prizes worth crossing oceans for, even when the outcome was uncertain and the risks were very real. A glasshouse bloom in a European estate might therefore carry a hidden history of mud, insects, storms, and desperation. Behind the elegance stood danger. Behind the display stood a chain of hazard that began in the wild and ended, if all went well, in cultivated luxury. Rare orchids once sold for fortunes in Europe. At the height of the collecting craze, certain orchids could command astonishing prices. A newly introduced rarity, especially one that flowered in an unusual way or came from a distant and difficult location, might sell for sums that placed it far beyond the reach of ordinary admirers. This was not just a market for plants. It was a market for prestige, novelty, and exclusivity. To own a rare orchid was to show wealth, taste, and access to something others could not easily obtain. That inflated value helps explain why the obsession became so intense. A flower was no longer simply beautiful. It became an asset, a status symbol, and sometimes a competitive trophy. The idea feels almost surreal today, yet it reveals the extraordinary hold orchids had on people's imaginations. In the right setting, a bloom in a pot could be treated almost like treasure, its rarity magnified into social and financial power by the desires of collectors. Some wild orchid populations were damaged by that collecting obsession. The darker side of orchid fever was the pressure it placed on wild populations. When demand for rare species rose, collectors and commercial suppliers often removed plants directly from their natural habitats in large numbers. That could strip a forest, a mountainside, or a local pocket of vegetation of orchids that had taken years to establish. In some cases, the damage was severe because the plants were not just rare in commerce. They were genuinely restricted in the wild. This gives the collecting craze a more complicated legacy. The same fascination that led people to admire orchids also helped endanger them. Beauty became a reason for extraction. Rarity became a reason for even more intense pursuit. It is a sobering reminder that wonder does not automatically lead to care. Human desire can admire a thing and still harm it. In the case of orchids, obsession sometimes reached so far that it began to erase the very marvel it sought to possess. Today, many orchids are protected because wild habitats are shrinking. Across the world, many orchids now live under legal protection because the places they depend on are becoming smaller, more fragmented, and more disturbed. Forests are cleared, wetlands are drained, grasslands are altered, and mountain habitats are reshaped by roads, farming, and development. For orchids, this can be devastating because many species are not simply growing anywhere there is space. They are tied to very specific conditions of moisture, light, soil, bark, fungi, and pollinator presence. When a habitat shrinks, the orchid does not just lose room. It can lose the exact web of relationships that made survival possible. That is why protection matters so much. Laws, reserves, and trade restrictions are not only about preserving pretty flowers. They are about defending complicated living systems before they unravel completely. An orchid in the wild may look delicate and still, yet its continued existence often depends on large decisions being made far beyond the flower itself. Some species survive only in one valley or forest. A few orchids occupy ranges so small that their whole known existence may be confined to a single valley, one mountain slope, or one stretch of forest. That fact changes the emotional scale of the plant immediately. Instead of being one example of a widespread flower, it becomes almost like a local secret of the earth, tied to one patch of climate, geology, and ecological history. If something happens to that place, the species may have nowhere else to go. This extreme restriction is one reason orchids can feel both miraculous and fragile at the same time. Evolution may spend ages shaping a unique flower, only for its future to rest on a very small geographic stage. A stream shifts, a forest is logged, or a fire passes through, and the consequences can be immense. Knowing that some orchids exist only in one landscape makes every location feel more precious. A single valley can hold an entire species' fate in silence. A lost orchid can reappear after decades without being seen. Sometimes an orchid vanishes from human view for so long that people begin to fear it is gone forever. Years pass, then decades, and no confirmed sighting appears. Yet now and then, one is found again. A botanist notices it on a remote slope. A survey uncovers a tiny surviving population. A flower opens in a place few had searched closely enough. These rediscoveries feel almost dreamlike because they suggest that absence is not always extinction. An orchid can endure quietly, hidden by terrain, rarity, timing, or sheer difficulty of detection. That possibility gives the botanical world an extraordinary sense of suspense. Somewhere in a forest, meadow, or cloud-soaked ravine, a species believed lost may still be waiting for the right pair of eyes. Of course, rediscovery does not erase danger. A plant found again may still be desperately vulnerable. Even so, the return of a missing orchid feels like the landscape whispering that it kept one secret alive. Scientists still discover new orchid species in the modern world. It is astonishing to realize that orchids are not merely old treasures catalogued long ago. New species are still being described in the present day, which means this family remains an active frontier of botanical discovery. Even now, researchers continue to encounter flowers that do not match known descriptions, whether in remote tropical habitats, difficult mountain regions, or overlooked corners of already studied landscapes. That ongoing discovery gives orchids a thrilling quality. They are not just subjects of history. They are part of a living, unfinished story. Somewhere on Earth, a flower may still be waiting for its first formal recognition, carrying a shape, scent, or evolutionary history that science has not yet named. This reminds us how incomplete human knowledge still is, even in a world of satellites, databases, and global research networks. Orchids keep showing that the natural world has not given up all its surprises. There are still petals unfolding beyond the edges of what we know. Some new orchids are found in places already heavily explored. Not every new orchid species appears in some impossibly remote wilderness. Sometimes a plant is discovered in a region that botanists, hikers, and researchers have visited many times before. That is part of the wonder. A species can remain hidden not because the place itself is unknown, but because the flower is rare, seasonal, easily mistaken for something else, or visible only under very specific conditions. This gives discovery a more humbling tone. It suggests that even familiar landscapes may still contain life we have not properly noticed. A forest path can seem well known, yet a new orchid may be blooming a few steps away, overlooked for years, because it opens briefly or blends with its surroundings. That possibility makes the world feel richer and less finished. Exploration is not always about reaching farther. Sometimes it is about looking more carefully. Orchids reward that kind of attention, revealing that even a studied place can still hold a botanical surprise. Climate change can disrupt orchids by shifting pollinators out of sync. Many orchids depend on timing that is far more exact than it first appears. A flower may need to open when a particular insect is active, moving through the habitat, and ready to respond to its scent or form. Climate change can disturb that timing by altering temperatures, rainfall patterns, and seasonal cues. If pollinators emerge earlier or later than usual, while the orchid continues blooming on its old schedule, the meeting may not happen when it should. This creates a subtle but serious threat. Nothing needs to vanish outright for damage to begin. The flower can still open. The insect can still exist. Yet if their rhythms drift apart, successful reproduction may fall sharply. That makes orchids especially compelling in a changing world. They reveal how much of nature depends on coordination. A healthy ecosystem is not only a collection of species, it is also a choreography of arrivals, signals, and brief moments that must line up with remarkable care. Logging can erase both orchids and their hidden fungal partners. When a forest is cut, the loss is not limited to trunks, branches, and visible greenery. Orchids growing on trees, in leaf litter, or on the forest floor may disappear with the habitat, but so can the hidden fungal communities that support their lives. This matters enormously because an orchid is often bound to more than a physical location. It may depend on bark conditions, humidity, shade, organic matter, and underground or decaying wood networks that took years to develop. Logging can break all of that at once. The visible flowers vanish, and the invisible partners vanish with them. This is why the damage can be deeper than it first appears. What looks like habitat removal is also the collapse of a set of biological relationships. Orchids make that truth vivid. A forest is not just a place where flowers happen to live. It is a layered living structure that holds together whole partnerships, many of them unseen until they are gone. Saving orchids often means protecting entire ecosystems, not single plants. An orchid can be moved into a pot, a greenhouse, or a protected collection, but that alone does not always save its wild future. In nature, the plant is woven into a larger system of trees, fungi, water, soil, insects, climate, and seasonal rhythms. If those surrounding pieces disappear, the orchid may survive only as a disconnected specimen rather than as part of a functioning population. That is why conservation often has to work at the scale of ecosystems. Protecting one flower is not enough if the pollinator vanishes, the forest dries, or the fungal network breaks down. Orchids teach this lesson beautifully because they make interdependence impossible to ignore. A bloom that seems self-contained is usually part of a much wider web. To save the orchid properly, you often need to save the habitat that shaped it. In that sense, conservation becomes larger than admiration. It becomes the protection of relationships, processes, and place itself. Orchid conservation can depend on seed banks and lab propagation. When wild populations become very small, conservationists often turn to methods that store future possibility outside the habitat itself. Seeds may be preserved in specialized collections, and plants may be raised through careful laboratory propagation to increase numbers or prevent total loss. This work can feel wonderfully paradoxical. A flower so associated with mystery and wilderness may need microscopes, sterile flasks, and precise human care to help secure its future. Yet that partnership between science and conservation has become crucial for many threatened orchids. In a lab, tiny seeds can be coaxed into growth under controlled conditions that bypass some of the dangers they face in the wild. Young plants can then be studied, safeguarded, or prepared for later reintroduction. These efforts do not replace habitat protection, but they do create a form of insurance. They hold open the possibility that a species may continue, even when its natural circumstances have become dangerously unstable. Some rescued orchids are returned to the wild with fungal help. Reintroducing an orchid to nature is not always as simple as planting it back in the ground and hoping for the best. Because many species depend on fungal partners, successful return may require attention to those relationships as well. In some cases, conservationists work with the appropriate fungi, so the orchid has a better chance of establishing, growing, and surviving once it is back in its natural setting. This is one of the most beautiful ideas in orchid conservation. The rescue is not only about the flower. It is about restoring the partnership that makes the flower possible. A plant raised safely by human hands must be reconnected to the hidden life of its habitat if it is truly to belong there again. That gives reintroduction a deeper meaning. It is not merely relocation. It is reunion. The orchid returns to the wild not as an isolated ornament, but as part of the living underground conversation that needs to begin again. Orchid flowers can last for weeks or even months. Many flowers announce themselves briefly, then fade so quickly that the moment feels almost accidental. Some orchids follow a very different rhythm. Their blooms can remain fresh for weeks, and in certain cases for months, holding shape and color with a persistence that seems almost unreal. That long life changes the whole experience of the plant. A blossom stops being a fleeting event and becomes an enduring presence, something that can be watched slowly as days pass and light shifts across it. There is a special kind of wonder in that durability. The flower does not hurry. It lingers, inviting repeated attention and rewarding close notice. In the wild, this staying power can extend the plant's opportunity to meet the right pollinator. In homes and collections, it helps explain why orchids feel so captivating. They give the impression that beauty can be sustained, held steady, and allowed to breathe in its own time, rather than vanishing almost at once. Some orchids change color as their flowers age. A bloom may open in one shade, then slowly shift as the days pass, taking on deeper tones, paler hues, or subtle changes in pattern that alter its whole character. This gives certain orchids an extra layer of drama, because the flower does not remain fixed from first opening to final fade. It develops visibly, almost like a story unfolding on the petals themselves. To a person watching closely, that transformation can feel intimate and surprising. The orchid seems to move through moods without changing its form. In some cases, the shift may also affect how the flower is perceived by pollinators, signaling a change in age or reward status. For human observers, though, the immediate effect is wonder. A bloom that seemed fully formed at the beginning reveals that it was still becoming something else. Orchids often refuse to stay simple, and this is one more example. Even their colors can be part of an unfolding performance rather than a single still image. Others bloom on old stems long after leaves have fallen. There are orchids that can seem almost finished, their leaves gone and their bodies reduced to what looks like a bare remnant of former growth. Then, from that old structure, flowers appear. It is a startling reversal of expectation. Most people imagine leaves as the obvious sign of life and vitality, so a plant that blooms after shedding them feels almost like a botanical contradiction. Yet this strategy can make perfect sense within the orchid's own cycle. Resources have been stored, timing has been arranged, and the old stem remains capable of producing a final or delayed display. The result is emotionally powerful. A plant that appears to have withdrawn suddenly reveals beauty from what seemed like absence. In that moment, the orchid feels wise in its own strange way, unwilling to follow the ordinary script. It reminds us that visible lushness is not always the whole story. Sometimes the most surprising bloom comes from what looked spent. A healthy orchid can rebloom from the same spike. One of the pleasures of growing certain orchids is discovering that a flower spike is not always a one-time performance. Under good conditions, the same arching stem can produce new blooms again, extending the story instead of ending it. This makes the plant feel almost conversational, as though it is willing to return to a thought it began earlier. What looked like a finished chapter becomes a renewed display. For people who live with orchids, that possibility adds suspense and hope to the period after flowering. The old spike is no longer just leftover structure. It may still hold future color and form. This habit also reveals something important about orchid energy and timing. A plant in strong condition can make use of what it has already built rather than starting entirely from scratch. There is a pleasing elegance in that economy. The orchid turns persistence into beauty, finding one more performance in a structure that seemed to have said, enough. Some orchids grow in dazzling clusters, while others flower alone. Within this family, display can take very different forms. Some orchids produce many blooms at once, gathering them into sprays or clusters that create a rich, almost overflowing effect. Others place their energy into a single flower, or just a few, allowing each bloom to stand out with unusual force. Neither approach feels lesser. They simply create different kinds of presence. A clustered orchid can look celebratory, almost like a burst of abundance suspended in air. A solitary bloom can feel more deliberate, as though all attention has been concentrated into one remarkable object. This contrast is part of what makes orchids so endlessly compelling. They do not follow one aesthetic rule. They experiment with scale, quantity, and emphasis. A listener can imagine walking through a world where one orchid dazzles by sheer number, while another stops you with one perfectly placed flower. The family contains both chorus and solo, each persuasive in its own way. Orchid names often tell stories about shape, place, or myth. The names given to orchids can open little doors into history, geography, and human imagination. Some refer to the form of the flower, pointing to slippers, bees, stars, or dragons. Others preserve the memory of a place where the plant grows, tying the bloom to a mountain, island, forest, or region. Still others echo older languages and myths, bringing in gods, monsters, or images that people felt captured something unusual about the plant. This means orchid names are not just labels. They are miniature stories attached to living things. A single name can hint at appearance, origin, or the sense of wonder a flower inspired when someone first described it. That adds a lovely dimension to the orchid world. The plants are already rich in biology, but language gathers around them too, trying to keep pace with their strangeness. Even before you see the flower, the name may already be inviting you into a narrative. People have admired orchids for thousands of years across many cultures. Long before modern greenhouses, scientific journals, and collectors' catalogues, people were noticing orchids and weaving them into medicine, symbolism, ornament, and story. Different cultures encountered different species, yet again and again, these flowers inspired attention beyond the ordinary. Their shapes were too strange, too elegant, or too distinctive to pass unnoticed. In some places, they were valued for fragrance or beauty. In others, they entered traditional practices, beliefs, or artistic traditions. This long admiration matters because it shows that orchids are not a modern obsession alone. They have been catching human eyes for centuries upon centuries, across landscapes and languages that never met one another. That repeated response says something profound about the flowers themselves. They seem to press on a deep human sensitivity to rarity, pattern, and living intricacy. A person in the present who feels captivated by an orchid is joining an ancient line of attention, stretching far back through time and across the world. To growers, orchids reveal tiny changes in light, air, and season. People who spend time with orchids often learn that these plants are sensitive readers of their surroundings. A shift in light exposure, a change in humidity, a difference in airflow, or the slow turn of the seasons can all show themselves in the plant's behavior. Leaves may firm or soften. Roots may advance or pause. Buds may swell, stall, or open according to conditions that seem subtle to human notice. This makes orchids feel almost like living instruments, registering details of the environment with remarkable finesse. A grower begins to notice the room more carefully because the plant is noticing it too. In that sense, orchids teach attention. They encourage people to read changes in atmosphere, temperature, and seasonal rhythm through a living companion that responds with visible honesty. This sensitivity is part of their appeal. They do not simply sit in place as decoration. They answer the world around them, and in doing so, they teach us to watch more closely. The more closely orchids are studied, the stranger they become. At a distance, An orchid may seem like a beautiful flower with a reputation for elegance. Then, the closer study begins, and the strangeness unfolds layer by layer. Unusual roots, twisting flowers, deceptive scents, hidden fungal partnerships, specialized pollination, extraordinary mimicry. The family has a way of rewarding curiosity by becoming more surprising every time you look deeper. This is one reason orchids hold attention so powerfully. They do not flatten into familiarity under examination. They become richer, odder, and more intricate. A person may begin with simple admiration, then find themselves drawn into questions about evolution, ecology, chemistry, and hidden life beneath the soil. Few groups of plants seem so able to expand in mystery as knowledge increases. Usually, explanation makes things feel more ordinary. With orchids, explanation often has the opposite effect. Understanding does not reduce the wonder. It sharpens it, revealing that the flower was stranger than it first appeared. Orchids turn the ordinary idea of a flower into something astonishing. By the time you have followed orchids through forests, mountains, swamps, treetops, laboratories, and history, the word flower no longer feels simple. These plants have stretched that idea in every direction. They can deceive, endure, imitate, collaborate, vanish, return, and bloom in forms that challenge expectation at every step. Some live in bright air. Some begin in darkness. Some depend on exact partnerships, while others captivate through sheer form and longevity. What makes orchids so unforgettable is not just that they are beautiful. It is that they keep proving how wide the botanical imagination of nature can be. A flower is supposed to be familiar, something easy to recognize and quickly understood. Orchids refuse that simplicity. They take the familiar outline of a bloom and fill it with invention, mystery, and deeply surprising ways of being alive. After spending time with them, the ordinary category feels permanently altered. A flower has become something far more astonishing than it seemed at first. As we come to the end of our journey, you might find yourself seeing orchids a little differently now. Not just as flowers, but as quiet masters of survival, deception, patience, and precision. From drifting seeds smaller than dust to blooms that can outlast the passing weeks, they have revealed a world shaped by time, partnership, and astonishing design. We wandered through forests and treetops, across mountain mist and shadowed woodland floors. We glimpsed flowers that imitate insects, blooms that open for a single fleeting moment, and others that linger as if time has softened around them. We followed hidden threads beneath the soil, where fungi and roots share a life that never meets the eye. And we saw how even something as familiar as vanilla carries a story that begins with a single delicate flower. Now, there is nothing more you need to hold on to. Let your thoughts slow, like petals settling at dusk. Let the details drift, one by one, until only a soft sense of wonder remains. Imagine a quiet place where orchids bloom unnoticed, swaying gently in warm air, untouched by hurry or noise. If you are still awake, you might enjoy the next journey waiting for you on screen. And if you enjoyed this one, you can like, subscribe, or leave a comment so more people can find their way here too. For now, just rest, sleep well, and good night.